All right. Welcome to episode 7 of Winning Time. It's Monday, July 27th. BT's raising the roof. That's Brian Trautschold over there. For y'all who don't know, COO of Ambition. I'm Jeremy Boudinet. Great to see you today, BT. How's your Monday going?
We're back again.
We are.
To the sponsors.
I'm excited about this episode here, man. We're switching formats. We're doing a kind of mega podcast episode on one topic, a topic that's very near and dear to both of our hearts. I love topics that involve like who's the greatest of all time, things like that. The GOATs. And this episode, we're covering the GOATs. So the GOATs of this episode are going to be the top 10 greatest SaaS companies of all time, in my humble estimation. So obviously SaaS being software as a service, been around for about 30 years now. BT and I have been in the SaaS game for what, BT, 13, 14 years?
It feels like multiple lifetimes, if we're being honest.
Forever.
Many moons.
And SaaS has been, I would say, the dominant in, Silicon Valley, whether you're in, any major tech hub, it's been sort of the dominant player in tech for the better part of 30 years. And now we've entered this sort of new phase, I feel like, where we might be entering an age where AI is considered the new SaaS, if you will. So seems like a good time for us to kind of look back and see who have been the movers and shakers the last 30 years. And I spent a lot of time making these 10 picks. I know you're going to comment on them. I'll quickly start maybe by giving my rubric for how I pick these companies. It's not based on what's their total market cap right now, what's their stock price. It does weigh in a little bit, but it's more like who came in when they entered the stage, really like became a turning point, you could say, for SaaS in some way, shape, or form. There was like a lightning rod moment. They were, like a huge influence in some aspect of the industry. So I'm excited, man, to talk about this. We're going to talk about the founders. We're going to talk about, what it was like for these companies when they arrived and what their impact was. So BT, you ready?
I get excited. I was excited when you hit me with the notes because I get to just trash these companies, but I'm going to just unabashedly glaze the people who started the companies. Which,
I like it.
That's a loose rule. That's when you're just on the color commentary guy who doesn't actually have to know anything. And he's like, oh yeah, what a player. What great.
Yeah.
Stats are bad, but what a player.
I love it. It's going to be fun because, I think there's some stat, BT, it was 90 to 95% of SaaS companies fail, SaaS startups fail. And these guys not only didn't fail, these were you could argue, 10 of the most successful founders, ever. And what they've done is the equivalent of like LeBron James or Michael Jordan or Steph Curry or someone in the NBA who kind of came in and really like took the game to new heights. These guys took the game of founding companies to new heights over the last 30 years or so. So I've got this in chronological order, BT, starting with the earliest, then going to the latest. So we're going to start by date of founding. So
let me hit you with a question because
yes.
I'm glad you mentioned the order with which you plan on unveiling them, announcing them. And it made me wonder, you chose the first one. I don't want to steal your thunder at all. That company, I don't think is the first software company, but do you think they declared software as a service being the business model?
That's a great question, whether they were truly the first to do it. I want to say,
factually, I don't think they're the first.
They're not. NetSuite, I think NetSuite preceded them, but this company did kind of like, I would say like they were the before and after point with SaaS. They made it a thing.
The watershed moment, like they're the BCAD moment.
Yeah, it's kind of like there might have been guys dunking in the NBA before Julius Erving, but Julius Erving made it an art, if you will. Yeah, no one cared
before.
Yeah. So my Julius Erving in this case is Salesforce. So the first company, a classic SaaS company, probably like the one who really set the stage for modern SaaS as we know it, founded in 1999 by one Mark Benioff. Current market cap of $134 billion, BT, still considered the vanguard in SaaS. Been through a ton of iterations over the last, 20 plus years. We have very intimate knowledge of Salesforce. Ambition was on the Salesforce App Exchange, when we first came out. We were built literally on top of it. What are your thoughts on Salesforce, BT?
Frequently hated upon, often maligned, and yet still the king, still the 800-pound gorilla. And I mentioned I was going to glaze up the founders. Mark Benioff, who has been part of my life unbeknownst to him for the past, more than the lifetime of ambition. So probably more like 13, 15 years. Just one of like the all-time great founder marketers, even before I think the current iteration of founder marketing, which is like X. And, maybe in some cases, there's some great people who are doing stuff on like Instagram and TikTok. But I think over the last iteration, it's really been who's great at like getting attention on X and on LinkedIn. And he's kind of like, an analog of that in the same vein of Steve Jobs, who was one of his mentors and who influenced him a lot. The cool thing about Benioff, and a lot of the nerds would know this, but the casuals wouldn't, is he was one of the top sellers at Siebel. Siebel was like the precursor market leading CRM before Salesforce. And what Salesforce did that was so genius in its infancy was, Siebel was this kind of classic software product. You had to literally install it on on-prem servers. It ran inside of your network. That's how that was the precursor to SaaS, and which made it really slow to interact with those programs. Like your workstation or computer had to like call out to the intranet or wherever you were getting your data from. And they just hosted Salesforce on the web, which in 1999, like you said, is like really a watershed moment. There were like little bits of software tools and, kind of the precursors to what we know today. And their whole marketing slogan was like no more software, and like this is the end of software. And at the time, Benioff is it's really interesting because he's punching his former company in Siebel, ultimately, which was owned by Oracle, and he's also doing it a way that at the time was not like the enterprise way, the enterprise standard. It was like, no one's going to actually like just be using this really key part of the business through a web browser. And like by going, there was no Chrome obviously back then, but you're not going to go to like, get on Internet Explorer, type in salesforce.com, log into your CRM and utilize it. None of that made any sense to someone in 1999. And so, not only to see that ahead of time is of course extremely impressive, but also to really be like the pillar of telling that story and to making that story turn into reality. There's no one else who could fucking get away with wearing Hawaiian clothes and using Hawaiian euphemisms all the time. And somehow Mark Benioff, who is a big, gregarious Caucasian guy, pulls it off. He's just pulling it off all the time. And it doesn't make any sense.
No, an outlandish, over-the-top personality for sure. Also, can't be understated what Dreamforce did. Dreamforce became almost like a cultural touchstone in SaaS. They got replicated by a ton of every company started doing its own conferences after that, it felt like. And just the fact that he was having Hillary Clinton and other luminaries like that speak at a conference.
The reason there is a Salesforce App Exchange is because Steve Jobs, on a phone call with Benioff, told him he had to do an app store. Like the way to really get distribution into the enterprise was to create an app store, be the platform that all of these different business apps could work with. And what's amazing is that worked out really, really fantastically, or kind of the corollary to an in-person event that Apple does every year, where Apple does their big launch event and they have all these people, and it's become kind of like this media-filled, star-studded event. Salesforce brought this consumer/buzzy news event and did that for boring business software.
Well said. Yeah, that's exactly what happened, man. They brought that buzzy B2C model right into business tech and made it exciting. And really that's had a lot to do with their success over the last 30 years. So great stuff, Salesforce. First one on our list. Second one on our list, which goes hand in hand. We're heading over to Boston, Massachusetts, BT. In 2006, Dharmesh Shah and Brian Halligan founded the behemoth that would become HubSpot. HubSpot, known as the leading marketing automation software really for the last 20 years. changed the game with marketing automation, became eventually a competitor to Salesforce with the sales suite, CRM, all that good stuff. Tons of lore around HubSpot over the years. There's a great book, Disrupted: My Life in the Startup Bubble by Dan Lyons, famous tech reporter, about his time at HubSpot, which is, I think, a must read.
Yeah, that is a key. I'm getting into tech. I want to know about this place. Read.
Yes. Yeah. Hilarious. Very insightful. A very negative portrayal of HubSpot, I would say. But actually, I think if you read it through the lens of a tech insider, you can understand this was a company that kind of embodied that. We're fun. We're a fun, high growth SaaS company who's going to take risks and do all kinds of wild out there stuff, but we're going to really dominate the landscape. And they did. So, yeah, man, what are your thoughts on HubSpot, BT?
Those guys you mentioned, Dharmesh and Brian, and once again, I don't know them very well either, but the thing that, back to, I think each of these companies will have a similar story. They figured out this great distribution model, which was, ultimately what they called their conference, which was inbound. And they, I think, are the preeminent all-time greatest SEO link capturing company of all time. And it's amazing to say that and be like, this is a $10 billion business that has built several now leading category products. And so you think about them as a amazing engineering and innovation company. But I think, I don't know, maybe argue that they were so good at SEO and at capturing front page results through listicles and top 5 ways and here are 4 steps to do a better email nurture. I mean, they own the internet. It's still the if you go Google stuff, which I know a lot of you don't Google anything, they own the results. Almost any kind of software category. And I think, what's interesting about those guys kind of doing the edge strategy, where by the time they were really becoming at scale, in the mid-aughts, Salesforce was a behemoth, even more so. It felt very ubiquitous in the enterprise, and they just became ubiquitous in SMB. And they started in SMB email marketing, very specific niche. And they've done a really great job branching out. I think everyone talks about people vibe coding their own CRM. I think the still real threat to Salesforce is what HubSpot does, because it is a really great product company that is uniquely good at getting people's eyeballs.
Yeah, great call out about what they did with organic demand gen in the 2010s is I've never seen it replicated. There was a period in the late 2010s where I think if you Googled anything about marketing, the first article that came up was a HubSpot article. It was insane, the dominance that they achieved with all things organic demand gen, SEO. Their email marketing was incredible. Their social was on point. They were early on YouTube. I felt like I honestly stole, as a new marketer in 2014, I stole almost every one of their tactics because it was this is what's working. Look at these guys. Look at what they're doing. They also had a very, I thought, savvy play early on, which was they really went after startups and sought to become known as the marketing automation solution for startups. They had a partnership with Y Combinator, which a friend of mine, former Texel advisor, still Texel advisor, actually, Kevin Reha, helped set up. But that ended up being a really big gambit for them. They sort of found their niche and were able to get in with that. So they did a lot of really creative, avant-garde things going on early in their career. Even having Dan Lyons, the guy who wrote the book about them, they hired him. This guy was a famous tech journalist, but it showed their commitment to, we're going to be a content marketing machine. We're going to go out and hire an actual tech journalist to come and work for us. No one was thinking that way.
Yeah, that ended up being a really replicated move. I mean, still today, Anthropic, I know they're going to be on the list at some point. AI, those folks are acquiring media companies now.
Yep.
10 plus years beyond that original kind of we're going to own our own media arm, or we're going to encapsulate the the network. And yeah, you're right. That was a really interesting move at the time. Still a fantastic move.
100%. So shouts out HubSpot. They were my second pick. Let's move on to my third pick, BT. Same year, 2006. We're going up to the Great North, though. We're gonna take it up to Canada, our friends up north. And we're going to talk about a company called Shopify, which you can credit them and Amazon for basically single-handedly creating the e-commerce business model. Shopify, $137 billion market cap. Every e-commerce company is essentially built on Shopify. They have total market domination. Really an incredible success story. And, a company that I think still is underrated in some ways, and one that has really changed the model for good. It isn't going anywhere, right, BT?
There's a couple cool things in here, and I'm trying to remember. I can't. You can correct me, or someone in the host show can tell me. Paul Graham's company that they sold to, is it Yahoo? Was it stores.com or like web store or something like that? The company that Paul Graham, I think, really leveraged he sold that company, and him and Trevor and that crew then started Y Combinator following that acquisition. But it's kind of like the precursor to Shopify. And Shopify, I think I don't know, this could be said for multiple of these companies on this list, but like if you go, if you're in the ecosystem and you hear about Shopify today, Shopify's 20 years old, 20-year-old company.
It's crazy.
And it still feels incredibly like cutting edge and like with the times and pushing the envelope. And Toby is posting his fucking like GitHub on X, and he's like coding live in the project in the product environment right now. Like it does not feel from the outside, as an outsider, it doesn't feel at all like a 20-year-old company that is public, that is, trying to squeeze the market. Like it's all by all means just like continuing to innovate rapidly. Like the CEOs, the CEOs vibe coding on the weekend parts of the product. So, and not just vibe coding, he's an actual engineer. But yeah, like really, really impressive company. Like you said, I think we owe a lot of the like fast style, fast fashion, bespoke brands to the ability for creative people to be able to throw up a store and throw up the fulfillment and logistics and production because of like a Shopify.
It's a great call. I mean, how many great companies exist because of Shopify? You could argue probably more than any other company on this list even, I think, can be credited with Shopify being their backbone. We have friends who have built, Stephen Vlahos and Grazi, there's like they've built entire industries based on this. So great job.
5-star boxed wine.
Yeah.
Go check out Grazi.
Yeah.
Friends of the pod.
Yeah. So shout out to Shopify, maybe the sleeper most impressive SaaS company, because to your point, still a very high Q rating, still beloved by their customers, hasn't aged a bit over the last 20 years, still very cutting edge. Next, BT. We are taken to 2007. So we're still about 20 years old at this point. And we're going to the company. I don't know if this company is like, they might be the opposite of Shopify. I don't know if they're as relevant right now as they were, but they can definitely be perceived as a turning point in SaaS. And that is Dropbox, founded by Drew Houston, currently has 6.8 billion market cap, still super impressive. Obviously came out, with the ability to, do file sharing and condense and compress your files, really changed the game, and made it possible for a lot of future SaaS communities to emerge. What are your thoughts on Dropbox?
Well, I haven't founded and or run any billion-dollar companies, so it's possible for me to knock anything that Drew did. One of the cool things about the Dropbox story, Y Combinator company, Drew, I think it's Houston.
Houston, yeah, you're right.
I think anyway, Dropbox and Box, previously Box.com, effectively start hand in hand. I can't remember which way it goes first. Aaron Levy is the CEO and founder of Box. Two companies, almost the same name, effectively the same product. I'm sure they would argue that at a time when, the problem was not super clear of like, what is, how do you share files? How do you share large files? It wasn't obvious that was going to be a multi-billion-dollar player market. And I think what's, most impressive about both of those guys, and Drew, I think recently transitioned out of Dropbox. Aaron is still kind of like, Benioff, maybe more so than Benioff. Like Aaron is really relevant, more like Toby is Shopify. He's like really, I think, on the cutting wave. Like he's riding the AI wave and riding how that, Box can impact the ecosystem. But Drew and Aaron had to go against, one of the craziest things, which is, once again, this is, I think 10 plus years ago, 15 years ago, you're competing with analog solutions, and then you're competing with like Microsoft SharePoint. And then you immediately get into this time frame once the market realized that Box and Dropbox had real businesses. Well, then you had Google, you had Amazon, AWS S3, which is like their big store component. The cost of storing stuff went drastically down also. So if you want to store your own files on Google Drive, it just became a whole different market because they had proven, both from like the technical aptitude side, but also just the customer adoption side, that this was like a real thing and like a real problem. And, to the founders out there, you kind of pray to be in big markets, and people are always like, oh, you just want to be in a big market. And like, that all sounds great until you're in like a market with the biggest fucking companies in the world. And you're competing against like iCloud with Apple and Google Drive and Microsoft's variety of shared products. And then you're like, holy shit, we just got dropped off in the middle of the ocean. We're surrounded by the biggest sharks ever. Like, that's the market those guys play in. And yeah, you're right. I think, it's incredibly impressive to have built and scaled, but it's also, to me, those founders going against, it's like you wake up every day and you have to go to war against the United States.
Yes.
United States, 3 different United States of America militaries. Those 2 companies, like very, very impressive with the competition they face.
Agreed. Yeah. And I think at Dropbox, you nailed it. I think of really 3 things. It's one, creating a new category, and then facing against giants. These guys were truly like the founders of like America during the revolution, where they were just massive uphill battles. 2, I think of the Dropbox versus Box, a classic, one of the early rivalries in SaaS. That was
the
super
name rivalry also.
It's super compelling from an outsider. Like, you almost feel invested because you want to pick one of those companies to support. I think we saw that happen a lot over the last 30 years, where you'd have these wild, epic rivalries. Like, it was like the Celtics versus the Lakers. And then number 3, of course, Dropbox became the inspiration for Pied Piper in Silicon Valley. So it's forever immortalized on HBO's Silicon Valley show. So shouts out to Dropbox. Great company. IPT, we're going to move forward to number 5, which is a fun one. From 2009, a little company called Stripe with Patrick Collison, the largest privately held SaaS company in the world to this day. I found that out during my research here, which I think is fascinating. Thoughts?
Look, I've said this about every company. What's really cool about Patrick and John Collison, who shout out our early stage investors in Ambition, those guys, similar to Toby at Shopify, you find this little niche that's like a pain in the ass, or like a little wedge, this pain in the ass part about selling stuff online, collecting payments as an online vendor. You feel like it's an unfair system, or maybe an extractive system of what you have to do, previous world. And then you build, effectively a little thin layer of the product that allows you to collect payments and to do that well, and to do it, with high degree of trust. And what those guys have done at Stripe is really insane, honestly. Like in whatever 20 or 17 years, something like that. And similar to Shopify, the amount of innovation that they have allowed to happen, because it was easy to collect payments, because it's easy to do commerce with other folks online and build that as part of your back end of your product or your service, is really crazy. One of the projects I love the most about Stripe over the years is they built a content platform, content community called Atlas. And Atlas basically shares all of these tips and tricks and guides. And it's kind of this living document to tell you how to start a company and tell you how to do all the things you need to do to start a business. And, is it content marketing? For sure. Is it like, SEO and, things that benefit the company? Absolutely. But it's also just like really benevolent, and it's like helping people become founders and start something. And the thing about the Collisons is, and I don't know them well enough to say this for sure, but I don't think they've ever thought like, man, how do we extract more value for Stripe? I think it is always about how do we make Stripe the best thing possible? And if we do that well for our users, our customers, people who follow us in the community, it will, benefit the company. And I think they're just super examples of amazing founders.
Yeah, well said, man. I've used Stripe Atlas and it is phenomenal. It really transcends content marketing to your point. It's like it's insanely valuable resource. You can literally found a company on Stripe Atlas. So it gives you everything you need, which is insane. I think Shopify is a great comp for it, where it's, to your point, it's still 17 years later so thoroughly dominates the market that there's no real competitors. I feel like, 'cause it is just so ubiquitous. And Textla, we used it. I'd be in there constantly looking at reports and things like that, and just an insanely valuable platform, and a platform that, like with Shopify, has enabled a whole ecosystem of SaaS companies to really easily be able to grow and thrive.
Yeah.
So
Unreal. Unbelievable.
Yeah. Shouts out to Stripe. So let's move on to number 6. Okay. This is a company that I vividly remember when we first adopted it at Ambition, and I believe 2014, a few months after I joined the company. It was like a before and after, and it was like it was like being part of a wildfire that was catching on SaaS, and that was Slack. So Slack, 2009, founded by Stuart Butterfield, really made team collaboration a whole different animal. It felt like, before and after. Before Slack, I remember we were using Atlassian HipChat, and I know you remember those days. And the experience with that versus Slack, the UX just felt like you had been shot 30 years into the future when you started using Slack. Thoughts on Slack, BT?
I'll do the old guy, been around the block a while story. This is another one. It's funny you mentioned like the box, Dropbox, because Slack, HipChat, eventually Yammer, like there was this whole series of like, what type of person are you? Discord was kind of doing this in the time. And I mean, shit, Reddit and Dig, like you had all of these like these little proxies, identity politics of which product you use. And yeah, we adopted Slack, obviously, or maybe not obviously, but for those who don't know, Slack is owned by Salesforce, was one of the biggest acquisitions in software as a service at the time when they sold to Salesforce. And what's really wild is, at least as the story goes, as far as I'm familiar with, is that is one of the most historically accretive pivots in the history of software, or at least venture investing. I think the way the story goes is Stuart and the small team, were building a game studio, I believe. And they had built kind of like basically like an internal chat program. And they were, I can't remember if they had like open sourced an element of it, or they did something where basically I think the companies, they like shared it with other companies in the venture portfolio or something like that. Now I'm like butchering the story, but it was like a side project within the thing that they were doing that they built to plan and chat about progress in the gaming product. And they realized that it was, basically superior to alternatives. They realized that there was actually like adoption of it. And I think like 4 years in, they pivot and commit to Slack as a product, and ultimately it sells for more than $20 billion to Salesforce, a decade later, which is, obviously an insane exit. So one of like the really cool examples of just extreme diligence to be working kind of in the desert for 4 years, have this thing that maybe you don't even value as having incredible product market fit and having incredible standalone value. And then when you see that, you lean all the way in and turn into, at one point, I think the fastest growing SaaS company ever.
Yes.
Amongst others. There were others that were all doing that at the same time. But I think they were the standalone favorite for quite a while.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And, always a good sign when, your company name becomes a verb. So Slack, Slack me, that was the thing for a long time. A product that's been every company I've ever worked at, and I believe will ever work at for the foreseeable future. So shouts out to Slack. So let's move on to our next one, which is a company we are very familiar with, BT, in multiple aspects. This company One, March Sassness, Ambition's annual software tournament, which ran from 2014 to 2018, hosted by yours truly, in a really exciting, fun tournament where their CEO literally did a video doing a bet against another guy, the team they were facing in the finals. They're an Ambition customer, I know, and they're a really well-known company. So let's talk about Zoom. Founded in 2011 by Eric Yuan, $25.8 billion market cap. BT, thoughts on Zoom?
A company, I mean, I got a lot of different things how I feel about Zoom, but like one of those companies that was like built for the moment, and the moment was obviously COVID pandemic in 2020. And, they went from, I think, kind of a novelty, better way to share, easier way to do screen sharing and video recording, and turned into the de facto way to do it. And like let's Zoom really quick, like became the verb. And another, interesting thing of like, there were, or at least I think this is like a fun recurring theme in these, there were really good incumbent players where the space didn't even feel like it could be won anymore. Like
Yes.
WebEx was the thing. Google Meet existed.
Ring Central. There were a lot.
Ring Central. What was the one? Skype. Like Skype was big back in the day. Kids probably don't know Skype anymore. Microsoft bought that product. Like there were lots of GoToMeeting. Like GoToMeeting was like
GoToMeeting
that we like a lot of people did, what we do on Zoom now. And the cool wrinkle of that is that Eric was a lead developer, lead engineer at WebEx for a number of years. And ultimately, I don't know, and I will speak on like why they left, but he, I think, and a small crew of engineers left, traitorous 8 scenario, and start Zoom. And, Zoom becomes, I think what most people would say was like a technically better product than WebEx, easier to use, easier to scale. You could have a lot of people on, which was why it was so big during the pandemic. And then, I think where the interesting thing of today is like, what's the next phase for Zoom? I think Zoom became a pillar of the infrastructure. You have to have that part of your tool set. And I get excited about that company of like, what can they do? How can they go beat up on the Gongs of the world, or the, in some cases, even like the Workdays or the Salesforces, like they're in the process, they're in between the conversation of myself and you on the other end. And so they have like a really cool opportunity. I think they have to figure out how to become not just the wire of how this thing happens, but also like why it happens here and why it's amazing. But Eric is, like you said, just a fantastic person, cool dude, clearly brilliant, and built an amazing business.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the most likable founders, I think, on this list, based on anyone who's talked to him or worked with them.
No offense to other dudes.
No shots. There's honestly a lot of likable founders on here, but Eric's the only one who's ever done a video hyping on my marketing
maybe
efforts.
One of those like leading personality traits. It's kind of like, you go through all these folks, and not that I'm like tight with any of them, but there's no one on here you're like, gosh, what an asshole. Like, I hate this guy.
Fair. There's a force of personality behind all of this. It makes sense because to build a company that's successful, you have to have that almost. You can't be an empty suit. So Zoom, great company. Obviously, the last thing I'll say about Zoom is I remember knowing multiple people who were Zoom AEs during the pandemic, and the stories I was hearing from them, I've never been so jealous. Like the easiest job of all time being a Zoom AE during COVID.
They like hadn't increased the quotas. They're all just like crushing every single goal.
Yeah. Like it's just inbound. Their whole calendar is just inbound after inbound after inbound with guys just telling me where to sign, and how to pay you.
Totally sucks. Totally sucks.
Yeah. All right. So next one, BT, we got 3 left. I want to talk about a little company that came out in 2012 and famously, I think, had the biggest SaaS IPO of all time a few years later. That would be Snowflake, founded by Benoit Dageville, $2.9 billion market cap. BT, thoughts on Snowflake?
This one might be the one I know the least, but I think as a company was one of like the most prescient in how is business going to work in the future. And, you think about like the early 2000s, and I think this company like really came out of the shadows in like the mid-aughts, 2014, 2015. And, we had webhooks, we had APIs, we had these things, but in the enterprise, it's like, how's all this stuff going to work together? It's not going to be like have rules, and you're going to have like, these big data warehouses, and the stuff's all going to have to interact. And, what they did that I think is really, really wild is like back to the box and Dropbox and Azure, SharePoint. Like, you build a product in a wedge that you didn't even realize was like going to be an enormously huge wedge. And famously, they hired Frank Slootman as CEO a handful of years in, who was previously at ServiceNow. And he's one of like, you'd probably say like the tier one operators. And most of the folks on this list still are the CEO of their company, but you have the awareness to bring in a guy who is an incredible caterer to the enterprise and like incredibly good at like setting the table. And now that company is like ubiquitous, and like everyone just knows they're going to have a data warehouse. They're almost their own kind of verb or noun in the ecosystem, where it's like, oh yeah, it's just in Snowflake. Like, it's just such a it's just became part of the lexicon. And I think it's I don't know. I mean, that's much younger than a lot of these companies, and yet it is just an incredibly fast growing, massive company.
Yeah, I think of two things with Snowflake. Number one, really arriving at the perfect time where SaaS was exploding. Data was exploding inside of all these companies, and it was becoming a very, very necessary to have a way to integrate and also just align all these systems. And they emerged at the perfect time to sort of be that solution. Were built for that, well engineered. And they were found by a bunch of engineers. I think that goes to the second point, which is they're the only company here that I think of the 10 where they brought in basically a professional CEO early on, sort of knowing this is not our strong suit. We're builders. We're going to bring this guy in to make sure the business runs really well. And that bet paid off in a big way because they have just dominated, ever since. So shouts out to Snowflake. An industry that continues to grow and will only continue to grow going forward. All right, BT, last two here. So we're finally getting close to, we're within the last decade, which is great. I want to take us to 2016. Big year. You and I were working together at that time. A little fun times. A little company called Figma entered the fold, founded by Dylan Field, currently sat at $11.2 billion market cap. One of the most fascinating journeys over the last decade. We had the failed acquisition with Adobe, famously, maybe the most famous failed acquisition of the last couple decades. And we've had highly contested. We've had counterparts go to work for them. Tony Jamile, shout out, joined the team early. Great eye for good SaaS companies. But Figma, fascinating company. What are your thoughts?
Another story, and there's a theme here where you go attack the top dog. You come for the king in Adobe Photoshop, and really the entire design suite. I'm selling it. But Figma's design suite, browser-based, SaaS-based, really flipped the model, which was, I think, the biggest beef with creatives and designers and product people, was that it was just a pain in the ass to use. And like kind of going back to some of these other stories is, Figma's kind of the epitome of, we're just going to put it all out there. It's going to be really easy to work with us. It's going to be really easy to utilize our tool. We're going to make it easy for you to share these. Like, one of the biggest problems with folks who may have never even lived in this generation, but like when you got a photo or an Adobe file, it's just like, oh shit, it's going to like be this whole hassle to even open it up and look at it. And they made it so easy to collaborate, to share the files, to look at stuff. It seemed inevitable. Now, I don't have like as deep of a founder story as I had about some of the other ones, but I mean, dude, what we can comment on is, can you imagine the meetings that went on when the Justice Department was like blocking that merger or that acquisition?
What a nightmare scenario for all the people who were there and had stock and were involved in it. A wild turn of events. That's still one of the most mystifying, I think, moves ever. And I feel bad for Adobe because obviously, Figma's they've IPO'd since. They're doing very well and continue to be a threat. I love what you said about it felt inevitable. Like it was one of those products where when it came out, and I actually got to use that in Extiva, we adopted, I think, in 2020. it was like, why hasn't this always been around? Like, why, like, how are they the first to like do this? It was a quantum leap ahead of trying to collaborate on like an Adobe file, which as a marketer, was always super frustrating versus being in there real time collaborating, commenting, working with designers to get stuff out the door. It almost felt unfair. And just a great example of like seeing an opening in the market, a really Achilles heel of the main player in the market, and just brutally attacking it with a great product.
Absolutely, like relentless. And they've now done the thing that we talked about with other folks, which was like they started with the creatives, they started with the individuals, and they scaled up to serve enterprise, serve startups. They won like the technology suite. I hate it for the individual folks who wanted that exit. And I'm sure that exit would have been, it's tough because I'm sure there's lots of people who are like, man, this is a great outcome to be acquired and to become part of Adobe and get the distribution Adobe has. And yet, here they are still fighting. Like they gotta just keep grinding. So shout out to that crew. We know multiple people who've been there, who've gone through the Figma door, and it's a badass company.
It is. So shouts out to you guys. Congrats to the IPO. I think it's still that obviously was somewhat of a good outcome still for the early stage people there. So this brings us, BT, to our last company. And I think it's an appropriate one to end on. I had two options here, but I went with one, and it's not the one that really started it, but it's the one that's winning right now. And that is Anthropic, who is currently, I would say, the leader in the clubhouse for all things AI. They still have a SaaS model as a company. They are a SaaS company, even though what they sell is an AI service. And what Claude has done the last year to basically go from being, I'd say, third or fourth in this space to being amongst people who are real AI users, the number one platform, is incredible. What do you think about Anthropic?
Relentless execution, and that's not a slight at Sam and the OpenAI folks. I think it's so early in the whole story of this market, and it's early in how the customer is changing, how companies are using these tools, how companies are using credits and tokens, which is also like rapidly changing. It's kind of mind blowing because on one hand, you're doing a dance of really, really hard innovation and like training models and building. You're a lab. You're doing like you're doing like lab work in development of these LLMs. And then at the same time, you're doing this business work and like the business development and the branding and like the mind share, like you said, of like who's using the product, how do they use it, how do they interact with it. So like you're building the use cases, building the story that you or me or whomever can understand and want to buy subscriptions for. And then, at the same time, you're doing this crazy public perception dance, which is like its own other part of the stool, its leg of like, we can't let adversaries get access to these models, or like, yes, we're maybe going to eliminate all the jobs. Like there's like this crazy story somewhere between hyperbole and nonfiction. Like who knows like all exactly where it is at any given time. And you still have researchers doing tier 1 lab work. You still have people doing, or like, frontier lab work. You have people doing, kind of like the classic marketing and sales. And it's going to be fascinating. It's a really big ecosystem shift. I think that maybe the thing I keep coming back to and talking to the enterprise is it rhymes with the cloud migration. And for a minute, people were talking about like the like internet migration or mobile, and I think it maybe is more like going to the cloud and on-prem, because ultimately what you're getting is like inference, and inference is going to be the commodity layer. But all these companies are going to have a slightly different commodity. They may have a different level of the inference or different cost of the inference. And, that's something that kind of rhymes with how AWS and Azure and GCP and before them, Rackspace and all of these other companies were, and before them, you had like your on-prem servers, and you could like buy like fucking racks for your office and all this stuff. And I think that's kind of where we're going to get to. But to brag on those guys, and it's a good choice because I think it is now at the other end of your spectrum, Salesforce being the BCAD moment. And now I think we're at a new BCAD moment 25, 27 years later of going into a different type of company, a really different, unique business model. And it's pretty amazing and pretty damn impressive to watch Dario and Sam and a handful of these other founders or leaders just like have, frankly, an epic cage match at the top or at the forefront, maybe. They're at the top right now, credits to them. But at the forefront of where this stuff is like just incredibly impressive.
Yeah, I think it can't be overstated the difficulty level of what these guys are doing because it's a war on every front. I mean, the product, I know it seems easy in practice to sell these products, but imagine like coming up with how do we price them? How do we there was not much of a playbook for any of this. I mean, it was literally these guys were having to figure it out on the go, and they've kind of figured out usage-based pricing and figured out how to package and promote all these new applications they've got, like Claude Code, things like that, get it out into the world. I think a big thing they've done is turning customers into advocates. Like, I think probably Claude's one of the biggest differentiators I think they've done is they've really, I can't get on Twitter or LinkedIn these days without seeing somebody talk about some novel, creative new way they're using Claude to grow their business. And I think that is probably the most impressive thing I've seen besides the product itself, which is, to your point, it's like a sea change in like how we're doing business nowadays. So it's cool, man. And shout out to Anthropic. We don't know where this is going to go. I agree. OpenAI could leapfrog these guys again, and there's a lot of other players out there. Could be some new player 3 or 5 years from now. Who knows?
I mean, I think it's just, a bot hovering above your desk, just waiting to murder you when you don't do the right thing.
That's the next phase. They're going to do a partnership with Palantir and then just call it a day.
We didn't say that. We didn't say that on the pod. Honestly, I know we're over time, but big miss on us and, Palantir guys.
You could.
Are back.
You could. All right. So Palantir, my two I could have put on here, but I didn't, were Palantir and Amazon Web Services, AWS. But I felt like.
Not bad.
Yeah. I felt like Palantir was cheating because like they had they could sell to the Department of Defense and with an unlimited budget effectively.
Who do you think Sam and Dario are selling to?
That's a valid point. It's a very valid point. So, and then AWS, I felt like Amazon, they can. I felt weird putting them as a SaaS company, given that they have their hands in so many things.
It's like they have a 13 or whatever, $16 billion SaaS company that's also inside of a giant retailer.
It's crazy. Yeah.
Shout out to everyone's favorite right now, Palantir. Shout out to Jeff Bezos.
Yeah.
That was sick. Hey, by the way, sick topic today. I hope everyone enjoyed it. We went a little bit into some fun backstories, some fun perspective. Maybe you learned something, maybe you didn't, but I enjoyed it.
If you're
setting it up.
For sure, man. If you're a SaaS founder or operator, hope you heard some stuff to inspire you. Hope you learned something new from us here today. BT, the historian, the best color commentator on the planet for all things SaaS, in my opinion. So, thank you for being a part of it.
Give the people what they want.
That's what we do, baby.
Winning time.
We'll see you guys next week.
Later, man.